Well, the world is in a geopolitical recession. That was the big takeaway from my conversation with political commentator, author, and the president of the Eurasia Group in January this year on the sidelines of the annual meeting of the World Economic Forum in Davos. We're almost halfway through 2024 and the world looks bleaker. President Putin is back. The Russia-Ukraine war rages on. Israel is continuing with its attack on Rafah in Gaza, undeterred by the opposition from the U.S. And there's been no breakthrough on a deal for a ceasefire. President Biden has hit China with another round of tariff hikes, even as President Xi courts Europe. Iran has lost Ibrahim Raisi, this even as the situation with Israel remains tense. All of this in the backdrop of key elections across the world, including here in India. Joining me now for a mid-year review on the state of the world is Ian Bremmer, who is here in India. Ian, many thanks for joining us on CNBC TV 18. It's great to have you here in India. Plenty to talk about, but let's start first with your read on India, given that you've spent the last few days here.
Well, I mean, it's nice to have something good to talk about, which is part of the reason I'm in Mumbai. Of course, you're in the middle of an election for the world's largest democracy, and the outcome looks very likely to be exactly the same government you had going in, with just about the same number of seats and 5 more years of a very popular prime minister driving a lot of economic growth and pretty strong relations with the rest of the world. So, that is a good story. That is an area of stability, and India's rise is not an issue that's giving countries consternation. It's not something when you talk about that everyone says, oh my God, what are we going to do about India becoming more powerful? People generally welcome it, and that is a good thing to hear.
Well, that certainly is a good thing to hear, Ian. But, you've been speaking with leaders from industry. You've been speaking with political commentators, analysts and politicians here in India. What's the expectation now? Because, as you said, the expectation is that there will be continuity, that the Modi government will return for a third term. What's the expectation on the road ahead in terms of reforms, in terms of engagement with the world?
Again, pretty strong. India is a country that has not only been a leader for the global South, very capably chairing the G20 and taking on a lot of issues that are challenges for lesser developed countries that feel like they're getting the short end of the stick from the advanced industrial democracies. At the same time, India is trying to develop bridge relations that are stronger with Japan, with the United States, with Europe. Canada is the only significant relationship among the advanced democracies that's really come a cropper. It's been mismanaged by the Indians, comparatively small relationship. Everything else is going pretty well. So as I said, when you talk about China's rise, in the early days, China's rise was welcomed. Later on, China was seen in a more adversarial way, in a more competitive way, especially because China's political system is authoritarian, China's economic system is state capitalist, and China's ideological narrative is wanting to achieve greatness that was stripped away from it at the hands of colonial powers. None of that's true about India. India represents the private sector economically. India is a democracy, even if not everyone in the world agrees with how that democracy is run all the time. And India's ideological narrative, as it becomes more powerful and moves to become the 4th largest economy next year, maybe the 3rd by 2028, is that they want to be friends with everybody. They're not threatening. Maybe that won't be true in 10 years' time when India becomes bigger. Maybe people will see it as more of a threat, as more competitive. But for now, India's rise is, as I suggested, almost universally welcomed, certainly among the G7, among the wealthy, powerful nations in the world.
Well, I'll get to China in just a bit, Ian, but, just to continue with India, at this point in time, the polls suggest that it will be a third term for the Modi government. But if there were to be a different story that plays out on counting day on the 4th of June, what could be the implications of that from a global perspective?
Surprise, bewilderment. A bunch of people doing Google searches on who the next leader actually is, because no one's paying attention to anyone but Modi on the international stage. But truly very, very unexpected outcome if that were to occur. Certainly not something that we at Eurasia Group are spending any time on right now.
Well, let's move on and talk about some of the other crucial issues. And I'll start by talking to you about what's happening with Israel. Just this morning, we've seen Ireland and we've seen Norway recognizing Palestine as a state. We've got a very strong statement coming in from the Israeli foreign minister saying that today's decision sends a message to the Palestinians and to the world that terrorism pays. Ian, the implications of what we've seen Ireland and Norway do and the likelihood and the possibility of others like Spain following through?
Well, I mean, I understand why the Israelis would say that. Certainly, the Palestinian position is getting more cover and more support from the rest of the world than the Israeli position is. But of course, the other perspective is that the Palestinians have been promised a state from lots of people for a long time, and they don't have one. And the absence of a state and the willingness to move on geopolitically in the Middle East, the Abraham Accords, the Iran normalization with Saudi Arabia, Israel illegally taking more and more land in the West Bank, all of that continues at the expense of the Palestinians. No one cares about them. And so I think the war over the last 7 months, and of course the horrible terrorism of October 7th, all of that makes a lot of leaders around the world, and you're seeing this in Europe right now, say maybe we can't ignore this anymore. Certainly no one is suggesting that Hamas should be allowed to take over the Palestinian territories. No one that's voting for the Palestinians to have a state is suggesting that terrorists should run it, that people should run it that don't recognize Israel has a right to exist. A two-state solution is not a Palestinian solution. It's a solution for two people living next to each other in stability and sustainably long-term. We do not have that right now, and unfortunately, we're not close to it.
No, we're not close to it. But, you know, staying with Israel and the challenge this throws up for global leaders, including President Biden and the U.S., Ian, you know, in the backdrop of what the ICC is saying, arrest warrants are being sought now for Benjamin Netanyahu, along with Hamas leaders as well. President Biden calling it outrageous. How do you see this playing itself out, the challenges that it throws up for President Biden and the U.S. in continuing to support Israel?
Biden's in a lot of trouble on this issue. The right wing, the Republicans, are saying that Biden is too soft, that he's the guy that is, you know, trying to cut a deal with the Iranians and reduce sanctions. He's the guy that says he's going to suspend some military aid to Israel, while most of his own Democrats are saying that he's whitewashing a genocide. And that he is not pushing Netanyahu nearly hard enough to prevent them from supporting Biden has said he demands a two-state solution, and his top ally, Israel, says no. He demands that humanitarian aid is let in, and his top ally in the Middle East says no. He demands that the Israelis not proceed with an invasion of Rafah, and his top ally in the Middle East, Israel, says no. That makes Biden look very, very weak. And the ICC ruling, which Biden does not support and could not support politically, only adds fuel to that fire.
Yeah. So as far as Israel is concerned now, and it insists that it will continue with its offensive in Rafah, as you said, President Biden caught in a dilemma now, supporting Israel, but also trying to draw a red line when it comes to Rafah. How do you see this playing out, also in the backdrop of what we've seen happen now in Iran with Ibrahim Raisi and that horrific helicopter crash?
The Raisi death isn't really relevant to the Israel issue. I mean, it's a little destabilizing at the margins, but he's not the guy that runs Iran. That's the supreme leader. That's the IRGC. That's the Basij. That's not going to change in 50 days when Iranians don't go to the polls for another illegitimate election for their president. But Israel is going to continue this war on the ground in Gaza. It is overwhelmingly supported by the Israeli government, by the war cabinet, and by the vast majority of the Israeli people. Almost no one else in the world supports that position. Not India, not the United States, not Europe, pretty much nobody. And that's a problem. It's a problem for the U.S. elections. It's a problem for global supply chain. It's a problem for keeping the war contained to Gaza. Unfortunately, as long as that remains the case, we're going to be talking about containing the war as opposed to ending it.
Well, talking about containing the war or possibly ending it, there is no deal on the table so far. Dialogue negotiations haven't worked. Given the fact that the U.S. is now going to be heading into elections in November later this year, and Israel, as you pointed out, is clearly not in the mood to listen to what President Biden has to say when it comes to Rafah and the overall picture. How do you see this impacting the U.S. elections and President Biden's electoral campaign?
Well, oil prices are around $80, which is roughly where they were before October 7th. So inflation is not getting worse on the back of this war, and that doesn't hurt Biden. But the Gaza issue does hurt Biden. This is an election that is being determined more by national security than any U.S. election since the 60s, since the Vietnam War, since the major instability inside the United States. You've got the border issue and immigration, which is about national security. It's the top issue right now for most Americans. You've got the Middle East, which is driving a lot of concerns. And of course, you also have issues of whether the United States is still a democracy and the idea that the other side is trying to destroy it. Those issues combined matter more to Americans going to the polls than the economy does. It's very unusual in the United States, but it is important, and Biden is not doing well on most of them.
Speaking of the presidential elections, at this point in time, it looks like Trump does enjoy the lead. And it also looks like the Trump trial hasn't really changed things or hasn't done much to change his support base as far as the elections are concerned.
Well, first of all, the elections are not until November. If you ask me what's going to happen in Russian elections in 5 months, I can tell you. I have no idea what's going to happen in U.S. elections in 5 months. That's a very long time for a democracy, especially with two incredibly unpopular men that are running. Also very old men. I mean, one of them could easily have a serious health incident and not actually be standing in November. That's still, something we need to at least think about in the back of our heads. But the reality is this election is still very much up for grabs. And you're right, that the judicial cases, the most serious cases against Trump, have been delayed, or they've been somewhat interfered with in the case of the Georgia case with this big scandal involving impropriety around the prosecution. But the Washington case has been delayed, which is very important, interference with the election January 6th. The Georgia case not going forward. The least important case in New York is the one that's being resolved, and not at all clear it will result in a conviction. So for those Biden supporters that were hoping that these 91 indictments were somehow going to bring Trump down, that seems almost certain to not be the case before November.
Well, we are going to take a break and continue our conversation with Ian Bremmer of the Eurasia Group on Global Dialogue. Stay with us. Welcome back. You're watching the Global Dialogue. 2024 is proving to be a more challenging year geopolitically, and things will get worse before they get better. We're in conversation with Ian Bremmer of the Eurasia Group. But let's talk about China and the latest impact of the decision by the Biden administration on the tariff hikes. You believe this is actually going to come back to bite the U.S. and this is a counterproductive move. Why do you say that?
It's not clear how much it's going to bite the Americans. The timing is not so bad. The Chinese understand there's an election cycle, and that if they hit the Americans back, that's going to lead to probably only more escalation, at least from Congress. Also, the Chinese economy is not doing well at all. That's why they have to continue to pump money in to ultra long-term bonds and into buying off real estate and using it for low-income housing. Pumping more money into regions that are insolvent. Some 40% of regions right now. Provinces in China are essentially in receivership. So the Chinese don't want a big fight with the Americans right now. And of course, geopolitically, the Chinese aren't doing so well in Asia. We see that in Northeast Asia, Japan and South Korea. We see it in Southeast Asia, the Philippines, Indonesia, challenging relations in South Asia with India. I mean, the Chinese are doing better with Nepal. They're doing better with the Maldives, but I mean, that's not exactly a portfolio, is it?
What do you see as far as the TikTok issue is concerned, Ian? How do you see that ending?
Well, not soon, because it's going to be lawyered up, and it's certainly not going to be resolved before the U.S. election. Biden almost never talks about it. Congress was driving it. Biden himself has a very active TikTok account that he uses for the election, and he engages with a lot of influencers. At the same time, Xi Jinping doesn't believe that the internet and AI technology should be wasted on consumption. He thinks that this is a distraction, and that the real purpose of these advanced technologies is for industry, is for national security. So he doesn't care a lot about TikTok, but he doesn't like being embarrassed by the Americans, and he certainly doesn't want to be forced under duress to have a Chinese national champion sell off an important asset. So I don't think they've decided what they will do when this gets through its legal cases. Also keep in mind that Trump has flipped on TikTok. When he was president, he was opposed to TikTok being owned by China, being controlled by China. More recently, he's focused his guns on Facebook, on Meta, and said that TikTok is fine. But of course, that's on the back of him getting a few $1 million in electoral funding from Mr. Yass, who is a major TikTok investor. And it is one thing you know about Trump's policy history, it's that following the money usually gets you closer to the truth than other avenues of investigation.
Well, so where does that leave China? You know, as you pointed out, it's troubled in its relationship with most countries in Asia, courting Europe, though, with President Xi on his visit most recently. How do you see that playing out, Ian?
Trip didn't go that well. He went to France, and he met with both Macron and von der Leyen together. It's not what happened when Macron and von der Leyen went to Beijing. There, Macron, who has been more warmly disposed to China, met with Xi individually. Von der Leyen didn't get that meeting. This time around, it was more coordinated. It was more hawkish, more concerned about Chinese dumping, more concerned about Chinese exports to Russia, supporting the war, even though not direct military weaponry. Then he went to Serbia and Hungary, the two countries in Europe that have the greatest levels of FDI from China in their economies. But let's face it, they're kind of on the periphery of Europe. They're not critical countries. So, I mean, this was not a trip of enormous success for the Chinese. It comes on the back of the 16+1 Chinese formulation of regular meetings with East and Southern European countries basically falling apart, the Baltics actively leaving and other countries not really interested. Also on the back of the investment deal between the European Union and the Chinese falling apart. So the last few years of EU-China relations have not been covered in glory.
No, they haven't. But let's talk about AI, Ian, because that was the buzz in Davos in January. And as things currently stand, I mean, we've seen some regulatory moves towards, putting guardrails in place and so on and so forth. In the last 6 months, what have you made on the way things have moved as far as the AI world is concerned?
That the technology is moving a lot faster than the governments, and that the businesses and the investments are driving that technology a lot faster than the governments. This is moving faster than Moore's Law. The large language models are exponentially powerful. They are having a huge impact in the way humans interact with them. They're starting to engage in innovation and productivity gains and waste reduction that I think will make a huge difference in the global economy. But they are also scary for society. They're scary for disinformation. They're scary for changing how we think about human beings. The people that are investing in AI are so competitive with each other and so worried that they'll lose out that you're seeing a collective action problem that does reduce the level of safety inherent in the models. I mean, you just saw that OpenAI, global leaders in AI, just had the head of safety and others around him suddenly quit, saying that they were concerned that the guardrails that they wanted to see were not being considered adequately by Sam Altman and his colleagues. That's obviously a concern. It's not unique to OpenAI. We're seeing this across the board.
Yeah, well, Ian, we're halfway through 2024. As I said at the start of the program, when we spoke in January, you were talking about a geopolitical recession. Things haven't gotten better. In fact, if anything, they've gotten worse. What would be your key concerns as we look at the world map today for the rest of the year?
Well, I referred to it back when you and I talked at Davos as the Voldemort of years. This was the year geopolitically that you really didn't want to talk about because you didn't have guardrails on the major conflicts. They were all likely to get worse. That is certainly true in the Russia-Ukraine war right now, both for the West and for the world. It is certainly true in the Israel-Gaza war right now, both for the West, the Middle East, and for the world. It's also certainly true, though, to a lesser degree, on U.S. China being managed comparatively well, but still you're seeing decline. It's getting more challenging over time. And then finally, in my own country, the U.S., the elections continue to see more divisiveness, more false information, more fake news, more people angry with each other. It's not an effective way to run a democracy. So this is just a challenging year geopolitically, and structurally, it's not going to get better before it gets worse.
Not going to get better before it gets worse, but any hope at all or any indications, green shoots emerging on any front at this point in time that you would sort of take note of?
Oh, there are all sorts of green shoots. They're the things that don't make headlines. India is one of them. The strength of the European Union is another. They recognize that Ukraine is a problem, that the U.S. may not be as committed as they have been historically. So the Europeans need a European pillar inside NATO, which will make NATO stronger. That's a big deal. I think the European parliamentary elections are going to be solid. The AfD in Germany, the far right, has imploded. So in a story of global populism and European populism, the most powerful country in Europe is actually getting more pro-European. The UK is going to have elections in a couple months, and the Labour Party will come back with a likely resounding win. They will want to be more engaged with the European Union after a number of years of Brexit. Mexico is about to have elections on June 2nd, just in a week and a half. Those are going to go very smoothly. AMLO will get the person he wants, who will be more technocratic and oriented towards smarter business and economic policies. That's a positive thing. One of the largest democracies in this part of the world, Indonesia, 140 million people went to the polls in one day. Smooth, fair, free transition, no problems there. A lot of places in the world that aren't making news, and they're more stable. But the places that are making news are a serious problem this year, and they're getting worse.
Well, yes. Thanks for pointing out the green shoots that we should also focus on. Ian Bremmer, it's always a pleasure. Appreciate you joining us here on CNBC TV 18. Good luck with the rest of your visit here in India, and look forward to hearing back from you on some of these crucial issues later in the year.
Great to be here in country. Absolutely.
Well, with that, it is time for us to wrap up this edition of the Global Dialogue. From all of us here on the team, for now, goodbye and many thanks for watching.